Hello my friends, and welcome back to another episode of Gardo Goes Geek. On today's episode, after its smash hit third season earlier this year, which is attracting all sorts of buzz for awards season, including one of the lead actors being nominated for a Critics' Choice Award, I thought I'd have a look at The Boys. Now, The Boys is a comic series I have very mixed thoughts about, although I don't regret reading. I think it is worth reading at least once, but the series, I think, does a lot of things way better, and I think changing the source material in this instance has made The Boys a sensation. Now, just a quick disclaimer before we get into the episode. Usually I put a trigger warning for sensitive content, or at least I try to. I forget sometimes, I make mistakes. If anyone raises it, I will address it. However, The Boys has a lot of triggering content, and it's kind of hard to talk about certain aspects of the plot and the story without mentioning them. As a result, there is a trigger warning in this episode where I will be discussing topics such as graphic violence, substance abuse, sexual abuse, sexual violence, mental illness, suicide, bigotry, racism. There's a lot of dark stuff in The Boys, and while the comic is definitely worse in how it presents certain things, there is a lot of triggering stuff. If you feel you would be triggered by pretty much anything, there is a chance it's in The Boys somewhere. There's even things like deaths of animals, and there are points where it's not nice. I'm just going to leave it at that. And so, while I will be not discussing these topics in great detail, I kind of have to cover some of it to discuss The Boys. So, this is the warning, okay? Also, as The Boys is an adult property, and, with bearing in mind this trigger warning, I will also be using, I'll probably be discussing some of the harsher language in The Boys as well. So if foul language offends you, especially the C word, which I may mention at one point, because one of the characters in this likes to use it quite a lot. I'm not planning on mentioning it just yet, but it may come up. So, fair warning for that as well. And with that, on to the episode. First of all, I just want to make a quick note apologising for any audio issues in this first part of the episode. The first 20 minutes or so, I've got a lot of audio disturbance. I was unable to clear it out, and obviously that was a chunk of the episode that I didn't really want to lose. I thought I'd made some good points. I don't feel that I could recapture them as well by simply talking over them again. So I do apologise. I tried to clean it up as best I could, but there's only so much I can do with the software I have at present. For what it's worth, I do think I know what caused the issue, and I have made every effort to address it going forward for the rest of the episode. So, for anyone who doesn't know, first of all, I should probably cover what The Boys is. The Boys is a comic book series written by Garth Ennis and co-created, designed, and illustrated by Derek Robertson. It was originally published by Wildstorm. They published the first 6 issues. Wildstorm is a subsidiary of DC Comics, and DC Comics cancelled the title at Wildstorm due to the very strong anti-superhero tone that the series takes. However, they gave the rights of the series to Ennis and Robertson and told them they could take it to another company, which they did. It was then revived by Dynamite Entertainment, who continued publishing it. It ran up until issue 72, and there was also a couple of limited series that released during the run as well. The first was a volume called Herogasm. The second was one called Highland Laddie. The third was one called Butcher, Baker, Candlestick Maker. And during 2020, there was also an 8-issue epilogue series released called Dear Becky. I think DC probably did the right thing for themselves as a brand by cancelling The Boys and distancing themselves from it, especially as the main antagonists, the Seven, are very explicitly based on the Justice League. And so I can see why they wanted to distance themselves from it. They also allowed Robertson, who was on exclusive contract to DC at the time, special dispensation to continue working on The Boys. And Garth Ennis even came out and said after it was finished that they'd probably actually benefited from Wildstorm cancelling the book because he felt that Dynamite gave him far more freedom than DC ever would have, saying DC probably would have died on the vine. The book would have been chipped away at until writing it was pure frustration. Whereas obviously The Boys is able to do quite a lot of stuff and tackles some very dark subject material. As I said, there is pretty much nothing that The Boys will not comment on. I will say that while I do recommend reading The Boys at least once, it is probably the most cynical superhero work I've ever read. I've spoken before about how there seems to be a trend almost of deconstructing superheroes, of trying to make them realistic and not, realistic by meaning grim and gritty and, not quite wholesome good boys. And that's very much true of The Boys. The whole concept for The Boys is that the boys themselves are a CIA-backed group of special agents who have superpowers themselves but are not superheroes. And their role is to essentially deal with rogue superheroes with the backing of the CIA. The superheroes themselves are all owned and publicised by a private corporation, that corporation being Vought. And there are multiple heroes around the country, all throughout America, even across the world. And all of them are owned by Vought. And their whole media persona of like a superhero or a supervillain or everything is all artificially constructed. Everything about them is a marketing tool, a propaganda machine. And the actual heroes themselves are shown throughout the course of the series to be self-centered, egotistical, downright cruel in a lot of cases. They are just horrible, thoroughly unlikable people for the most part. There are a few exceptions throughout the title. And the main group of superheroes is the Seven. The Seven are just the flagship superheroes in the world. They're led by a character called Homelander, who's a very obvious pastiche of Superman. He's supported by Black Noir, who is essentially this universe's Batman, and Queen Maeve, who is this universe's Wonder Woman. There's also the Deep, Aquaman, Jack from Jupiter, who is the Martian Manhunter, and A-Train, who is the Flash. They are joined very early on in the first volume by a new character called Starlight. She is replacing a former member of the Seven called Lamplighter, who it is revealed was dealt with by the boys. In fact, the last altercation with Lamplighter is one of the reasons why the boys was disbanded for a while. And Annie January, the character of Starlight, and Wee Huey, who is a young man with a striking resemblance to Simon Pegg in the original comic, are the point of view characters for the story. Essentially, Starlight is our view into the Seven, while Huey is our view into the boys and the world that they inhabit. Sort of peeling back the layer. And Starlight as well, in her own naivety, is exposed to, sort of the seedy underbelly of superheroes and, what the Seven are actually like herself as well. Huey comes into the story because his girlfriend Robin is killed in an altercation between A-Train and a supervillain. And Huey is then recruited by the leader of the boys, Billy Butcher, a loud Cockney former Falklands soldier who's accompanied by a small bulldog named Terror. And Butcher is essentially the leader of the group. But yes, this is a comic that I think actively hates its superheroes. And I think a large part of that comes from Garth Ennis himself. And it was probably very much a product of its time, influenced by Ennis's own distaste for superheroes. He's explained since that his issue with superhero comics is not over the genre in and of itself, but more over its dominance in the comic book industry, and thus the constraints that get imposed upon the creators of those stories by publishers. And I think this is obvious when you look at Garth Ennis's work. Like, his most popular work is probably his work on Preacher or his work with The Punisher. Both of whom, I know Punisher is ostensibly a Marvel character, but he's not a superhero. So there is no superheroes in Garth Ennis's Punisher work, with the exception of Punisher Kills the Marvel Universe. Like, his Punisher Max title essentially exists in a world where Punisher is an older man in his 50s, a former veteran of Vietnam, who, well, probably older than his 50s now, but just based on the time limit, but the time it was written, in a world where there are no superheroes. And I like the Punisher Max book. I think it's a very good take on the Punisher. Very brutal. Like, there are some very brutal kills in it. But a lot of the people that get horrifically killed are also people that you really want to see horrifically killed. Like, for example, in the Slavers arc, the Slavers themselves are awful people, and yeah, you're happy when Frank kills them. The Boys has elements of that, in that this time the despicable people are superheroes for the most part. Ennis had a quote on this, actually, which I did save because I thought it was very good. He said, "I find most superhero stories completely meaningless, which is not to say I don't think there's potential for the genre. Alan Moore and Warren Ellis have both done very interesting work with the notion of what it might be like to be and think beyond human. See Miracle Man, Watchmen, and Supergod. But so long as the industry is geared towards fulfilling audience demand, i.e. for the same brightly coloured characters doing the same thing forever, you're never going to see any real growth. The stories can't end, so they'll never mean anything." And I've got to say, I do kind of agree with him to a point. Part of the issue with ongoing comics, especially ongoing superhero comics, is they don't end, and the audience and the creators, when the audience grow up and become the creators, want to keep those characters around. They can't let them grow and evolve and change. Any major change seems to get undone, whether it's a wedding or children or a death. And there's a frustrating impermanence with superhero comics. And so I totally get why someone like Garth Ennis was fighting back against that. And The Boys is very definitely a challenge to that. And this is one reason why I think it is worth reading. Despite the cynicism, despite the absolute pessimism with which it approaches its subject matter and its characters. Like, it is so cruel to the superheroes in this. But every story and every chapter within this story has a beginning, middle, and an end. And the ending is the most important bit. There are ongoing plot threads throughout The Boys that go across multiple characters and across multiple volumes of the series. But there are also done in ones. There are also smaller side adventures. And they're all good. Like, there is some very good storytelling in The Boys. There are some absolutely horrible people in it. But there is some good storytelling. And there's, like I said, there's plenty of cynicism and plenty of things that I think have been done way better in the show. Like, I'm not above giving credit where it's due and saying that of the two, the comic and the show is the far superior product. But Garth Ennis was clearly setting out to tell a story, and he does tell that story. Like, this story is there, and it's, for the most part, it is pretty good. It's pretty solid. And, you know, by the time this series ramps up towards its ending, like, the last 2 volumes both resolve ongoing plot lines and bring the series to a very good conclusion. A conclusion that feels natural and feels earned. And, you know, every character's story definitively ends. And that's a good thing, I think, sometimes. This is one reason why I quite like the MCU, is because actors have aged out of the roles, stories have ended. Like, I've spoken about this before. I think, for example, something like Hawkeye or Thor Love and Thunder works very well as an epilogue for the character rather than just another element in their story. And, you know, I like the fact that characters like Iron Man and Captain America have been able to retire. As much as it will be a shame that, you know, we won't see them with the X-Men or with, won't see them with the Fantastic Four. It's like, no, these characters deserve to have a chance for their stories to end. And I like that that's happening. And I think that is one of the strengths of The Boys, especially when you compare it to so many other superhero comics, which are just ongoing stories. Even something like DC, which reboots. For the most part, the only time you get a conclusion to a character arc is when the writers change. The writers will come on with their story arc in mind, a story they're trying to tell. They'll end it, and then they'll go off. But then another writer will immediately take over and sometimes undo everything that was done. Every character progression that was done, every shift or change will be undone. And like I said, this is one reason why I do like The Boys as a comic, because it ends. You know, as distasteful as I find some of it, and I really do. There are some parts of The Boys that are just objectionable edgelord humour. I mean, it came out it ran for 6 years from 2006. And, you know, if you think about the humour that was around in the aughts, You know, I was a young adult then. I turned 18 in 2004. So yeah, I would have loved this had I read it a few years beforehand. I've been totally all over it, and I made this was the sort of humour that I saw many people identify with, for better or worse. And I can see why it became a sensation, but it does mean some elements of it have aged poorly. But at the same time, the bits that are good in here are still good regardless. And the ending is worth it. But what I want to discuss when we talk about The Boys is that, like I said, I want to look at the series. And specifically, I want to look at how the series has adapted and changed plot lines from the comics. And so I'm going to be discussing spoilers for the comics, but only spoilers for events that have already been depicted in the series. And I'm only going to talk about how they differ, because I think it is how they differ which shows why the television series is the superior version of The Boys. So, hopefully you'll join me. So I suppose the first thing I should mention is the characters themselves. There are some pretty big differences with a lot of the characters on the show to their comic book counterparts. And I'll start with the members of The Boys themselves. Billy Butcher is probably the best place to start. He's the leader of The Boys, and is a London-born man who has come to America, and he is seeking revenge on the Supes for specifically Homelander, who he blames for the rape of his wife Becky. Now, I'll come to Becky in a minute, because there's a very big difference there. But in the comics, Butcher has a very pronounced hatred for all of the Supes. But he himself, as well as gathering the boys, also uses the Compound V to take out the Supes. Like, the boys in the comic use this Compound V pretty much from the start. Temporary V isn't really a thing. And in the comics, or if it is, they dose themselves up before every fight. And the fight, that the powers it gives them aren't as pronounced as they are in the show either. They just get basically strength and durability, which allows them to go toe-to-toe with superheroes. And in fact, Compound V is a bit more of an open secret in the comics in general. Like, one of the first story arc actually features a whole load of sex workers taking like crystallized Compound V alongside cocaine, purely so that they can survive the sex with the superheroes. So yeah, it's a bit grim, this stuff. In both cases, Butcher was recruited by Mallory. Now, Mallory in the comics is a man, and in the show is a woman, Grace Mallory. Mallory was a CIA agent who was looking to put together a team to essentially investigate the Supes. And Butcher was Mallory's first recruit. In fact, Butcher is then responsible for recruiting a lot of the other members of the boys. Mallory is no longer involved with the boys due to an altercation with the Seven. And in both cases, Mallory approaches Butcher after what happens to Becky, or Becca, as she is known in the show. Regarding Becca, in the comic, Becky is dead. Like, before the story starts, she is dead. She never reveals the rape to Butcher. and she is killed when the baby inside of her rips itself out of her and starts flying around the room shooting lasers. So obviously Becky dies. Butcher then proceeds to grab a lamp and beat the baby to death, this flying fetus super thing, and beats it to death. And then someone from Vought approaches him with like a cover story for her death, and that's when, you know, the Butcher decides to blind the guy, which is when Mallory approaches him. In the show, it wasn't quite like that. In the show, it's revealed that, well, he's shown a video of Becca going into Homelander's office, and she comes out, presumably after having been sexually assaulted. And she then disappears afterwards. And Billy doesn't know what happened to her. He presumes that Homelander has killed her, or that she killed herself because of what Homelander did to her. And it's eventually revealed at the end of season 1 that she's still alive. And so is the child, who in this is called Ryan, and is very explicitly Homelander's son. Now, there's some bigger twists regarding this whole story that relate more specifically to Homelander, so I'll get into those in a bit. But right off the bat, that story arc at the end of season 1 shocked me. And it then it continued to strain the relationship between Becca and Billy. And then Becca dies in season 2, but Ryan is still alive. And Billy now has a quite fraught relationship with Ryan. And obviously, you know, Ryan is the only thing he has left of Becca, the only thing that still reminds him of Becca. So yeah, it's dark. So Billy leads the boys, but the main point of view character for the boys is Hugh Campbell. Now, he's called Wee Huey in the comics because he is actually Scottish. He is not Scottish in the show. In the show, he's American. And the only character that still kind of calls him Wee Huey, because obviously the actor Jack Quaid is quite tall, is Frenchie. And then we'll get to Frenchie in a minute. You know, he calls him Petit Huey, which is obviously the same nickname that he was given in the comics. Now, Huey is a much more capable character in the show. Huey in the comics he grew up in rural Scotland. He's an adopted child. He had quite a bizarre childhood. You know, he had a lot of quite prominent things happen to him during his childhood, which come up during the show, and some are very, you know, ranging from the bizarre to the quite traumatic. And, you know, what they do prove is that he's got a natural skills as a detective. He picks up a lot of things quite quickly, and he uses those skills with the boys. He becomes a very, very good detective. He's able to reason out a lot of things that Butcher and the others miss in some of the early story arcs. Now, Huey becomes involved. He gets introduced to the world of superhumans in the comics when his girlfriend Robin is accidentally killed by A-Train. And that's true in both. In the original comics, though, however, Robin is killed because A-Train is battling a supervillain. And essentially throws that supervillain through Robin. So she's killed as almost collateral damage. And you know, it leaves Huey holding her now severed hands and forearms. And yeah, it's traumatic. The show, I think, nails it even more because A-Train just runs through her, you know, and then like he's just running, and then apologizes and says he can't stop and speeds off. And yeah, I'll come to that in a bit as well when I talk about A-Train. But yeah, I like Huey, and I do like this. I like both versions of Huey. Huey is a very relatable character. There's a lot to like about him. He's very likable. Butcher describes him as reminding him of his younger brother, because if you've seen season 3, Butcher's backstory with his brother is very similar. And in fact, Butcher then left home by joining the British Army and serving in the Falklands. However, that isn't true in the show, obviously. Butcher's too young. But, talking about Huey, Huey, having grown up in Scotland, doesn't have the exposure to superheroes in the comic. He knows nothing about them. He knows very, very little. He doesn't know who the Seven are, or I think he might vaguely be aware of the Seven, but he's not aware of most of the other superheroes. And there are a lot more superheroes in the comic. Now, in the show, as an American, Huey is more aware of the superheroes. We see that he had superhero merchandise, superhero toys, you know, superhero posters. He was a fan of these heroes before everything happened, and he has quite a lot of knowledge about them. Now, I don't know if it's ever been confirmed, but I do think that Huey's lack of knowledge about the superheroes feels very accurate to Garth Ennis's own view on superheroes himself. Ennis has kind of said that, obviously, comics in Britain, I mean, you know, to discuss comic books in Britain, when Garth Ennis was growing up, were very varied. It was things like, you know, there were science fiction comics, there were slice of life comics, there were detective comics, there were adventure comics, war comics, as well as, you know, fantasy and superheroes and the things you would expect. Although not many superheroes. Superheroes are not particularly prevalent in British comics. Superheroes, however, are very prevalent in American comics, to the point that at times it seems like they are all that exists in American comics, which is part of Garth Ennis's issue with superheroes. You know, is that they have dominated the industry. They have removed the ability to write about anything else and have it sell. And obviously in recent years this has changed, you know. Image Comics have done a whole line recently, multiple lines in fact, that do not feature superheroes or often superpowers and are very slice of life. As well as more crime comics and other types of adventures. I know one that was quite critically lauded was Snot Girl, which I know very little about, but it just seems like a nice slice of life comic. And, you know, the dominance of superheroes isn't really a thing outside of America, and I think Huey might have been a commentary on that in the comic. In both cases, though, Huey's development as one of the boys is very gradual and involves a lot of accidents. However, I do think the show version shows a lot more agency than the comic book version at parts. And that's not to say that the comic version is without agency. There are a lot of points where the comic version shows himself to be a much better character. Like there's a very early arc where he picks up on something. I don't want to spoil it for, for people who haven't read the comic. But he picks up on something that Butcher completely misses. And the reason Butcher misses it is because Butcher is, well, quite bigoted in some of his opinions. There's no other better way to say it. Whereas Huey, being much more compassionate and empathetic, picks up on this thing. And that's true in some of the more memorable story arcs in the boys comic as well. They focus on Huey and his connection to other characters. He's able to form connections very, very well. And it's not that I don't think the show version doesn't have that, but the show version is a very, very different character. And it's like, for example, his decision to kill Translucent is his decision. As bad as it is, it's his decision. Huey in the comics also kills a superhero during one of his first appearances. He punches the Teenage Kicks member, Blarney Cock, and punches a hole right through him. Which shocks Huey, although he quickly gets over it because, of course. But yeah, he punches straight through him and kills someone, and obviously he's shocked because the only reason he's done it is because of the power of the 10th V that he's been, the V that Butcher injected him with earlier on in the story arc. Against his will, by the way. Again, when in the show Huey does decide to take the temporary V, it's his decision. It's a bad decision, but it's his decision. So yeah, I've got more to say on Huey as I go on, but it relates more to other characters, because Huey becomes a very key point of view character, so he's involved in quite a lot of the plots and has connections to other characters, so I'll get to that in a bit. Mother's Milk is the next major member of the boys that I want to talk about. Now, Mother's Milk is a drastically different character. Well, he is and he isn't. He's Marvin Milk in the show and Baron Wallace in the comic books. Now, things that he has in common are that he has, he's very cool, very calm, has a difficult home life with, his child and his ex, his partner, although but yeah, the differences there are more drastic in the comic because his daughter Janine is a bit older. But MM in the comics is a soup. And the reveal of him being a soup and the nature of his powers is definitely interesting. A little bit messed up, but definitely interesting. And yeah, I don't want to spoil it because yeah, I had quite a visceral reaction when I first read it, and I feel like you should too when you read it. So I'm not going to spoil that. Enjoy. But just like in the comic, the show version has a history with Vought. It's more pronounced in the comic because of his own nature as a soup, but in the show, it's very different. In the show, he has a past history with Soldier Boy, which becomes prominent in season 3. But in both cases, they're linked through his father. It's his father who is campaigning against Vought because of the things that have happened to MM's family. And, MM seeing what that did to his father has then motivated him to sort of carry on that campaign, which is what led him to the boys. I will say he's probably nicer in the show. He's a lot calmer, and he feels more like a second in command and more like the heart of the team. He's not quite the heart and soul of the group in the same way in the comic as he is in the show. To the point that, when he's not around, the boys seem a bit more brutal. And speaking of brutal, that leads to the other two members of the boys. First is the Frenchman, or as he's known in the show, Frenchie, whose real name is Serge. Frenchie he was caught for assault on a soup and thus brought into Mallory's services in the show. He also has quite a traumatic history because of childhood abuse from his father, and a lot of dark bits in his history involving his friends. Like there's a friend who overdosed, which is why he ends up losing sight of Lamplighter. And obviously that's the big, important backstory in the show, because that's what leads Lamplighter to attacking Mallory and killing Mallory's grandchildren, which happens in both versions. And now, Frenchie in the show he's a great character. He's very complex, and he has, again, some quite emotional scenes, particularly in his relationship with the female, who we'll talk about in a minute. There is a relationship between the Frenchman and the female in the comics, but it's very, very different. Like, they get along really well, but they sort of play very bizarre games like paintball, Scrabble, reverse strip poker, and it's still, there's still elements of it that are true, like that he was the first person to have ever really treated her with any sort of kindness or civility, and he forced the mafia to stop hiring her as a hitman in the comics. And I think the line, which he says in the comics, which is, "I'd rather die than not be your friend," when she threatens to hurt him. I think that they even adapted that in the show when they fought at some point. And yeah, in the comics, the Frenchman and the female are the muscle of the team. Frenchman is like a loaded gun in the comic. When he goes off, people die. Or get seriously maimed. And, his triggers are very bizarre. But he's also the source of quite a lot of genuine comedy in the comic book. And while he definitely has his funny moments in the show, it's not quite to the same level. Meanwhile, the female, in the comics, she is very, very different in the show. In the show, she is Kimiko, and her and her brother, as children, were captured by a liberation army that killed their parents and then experimented on them, giving them both superpowers. So they both have Compound V-based superpowers. She stopped speaking and learned sign language with her brother so that they could safely communicate, which she then teaches to Frenchie. In the show, that's not quite the case. Sorry, that is the show. In the comics, she's not quite the same. She doesn't have this relatable backstory. I don't think you ever really learn her name. She is still mute in the comic, but she does have like one line towards the end, so it suggests that she's not permanently mute. But she also doesn't communicate with sign language. There are still some similarities, like she does the scene where she attacks the mob, where she's working as like a mob hitman, like rips someone's face off. That's in the comic. In fact, that's her first appearance in the comic. And, you know, she definitely does have powers in the comic, you know. I don't think she ever heals, but she's shown to be completely... Like, again, if the Frenchman is a loaded gun, she's a bomb waiting to go off. You know, just the slightest touch will send her into a killing spree. You know, she's very... Yeah, very, very, very dark in the comic. The biggest change to the boys in the show, though, as far as I'm concerned, is not necessarily anything to do with their characters, but more something to do with them as a unit, which is that when we meet the boys in the show, and obviously this does change as the show goes on. The show's been on for several years at this point. But when we first meet them in the comic, they are officially sponsored by the CIA. You know, Butcher has a contact at the CIA that he uses. In fact, that character is Susan Rayner, who appears in season 1 and has her head blown up when they reveal the truth about Compound V to her. You know, she's the CIA officer who Butcher was trying to negotiate with in the show. In the comic, she's one of the directors of the CIA. She was a field officer in Afghanistan who despises Butcher, but the two of them are still shagging, for want of a better term. They essentially hate fuck each other. And she's horrible. She does lots of very immoral things, but considers all of it being done for the greater good. Absolutely horrible. And yeah, so she becomes a much more prominent character in the comic book. In fact, I think she runs all the way to the end, whereas obviously in the show, she's dead. She died a while ago. You know, when after she sort of learned everything about Compound V and started putting things together, and in fact, in a meeting with the boys, all of a sudden her head explodes and she's gone. So, yeah, but. Yeah, so in the comics, they have a very definite connection to the US government. You know, not just Rayner as well. There's also an analyst called Kessler that Billy refers to as Monkey and is horrible to him. And yeah, you know, he uses Kessler as like, he uses Kessler to get information. And so, yeah, they have an actual government link. In the show, they don't. For a large part of the show, they don't. They're on their own. The boys' program was shut down after what happened to Mallory. And in fact, they do give the boys in the comic a link. They actually create like a superhuman bureau in season 3. And it's applied to be a federal bureau. And it's headed by Victoria Newman, who is a former congresswoman, I believe. And yeah, Victoria Newman is heading up this Bureau of Superhuman Affairs. And that becomes like the boys' official sponsor, almost. Like, they occasionally feed the boys information, the boys occasionally capture a supe and send him their way. And Huey, by this point, is actually working at the Bureau with Newman. Newman herself is adapted from a character in the comic. Again, a gender-switched version of the character. And also a very, very different version of the character. The character she's based on is Vic the Veep, who in the comics is the vice president. And he is an idiot. Like, literally an idiot. He is... Garth Ennis designed him as the most grotesque parody of George W. Bush imaginable. He is a complete moron. Basically, every mid-2000s depiction in, satirical comedy of how George W. Bush was believed to be, that's Vic the Veep. A complete moron, an idiot who is good for nothing and is... he is trying to be installed by Vought as president rather than vice president purely because they think he'd be easy to control. And Newman, in the current series, or the series that just finished, Series 3, she's planning to get nominated as vice president. And she's made a bargain with Homelander to do it. But more than that, she's also revealed to be the adopted daughter. She's the supe herself. She's the one that's been blowing up heads. And, she is the adopted daughter of Stan Edgar, who I will get to in a bit. He's one of the Vought characters. And he's played brilliantly by Giancarlo Esposito. And again, I really like the twist that they've done with Newman in this. She is a much more capable villain than Vic the Veep is. Because Vic the Veep is... some parts of it are just sad. Like his appearance in Herogasm, for example, in the comics... is just sad. Like, not sad as in emotional, like sad as in this is a pathetic parody. Like, I really find it, Vic the Veep, one of the most tiring aspects of the comic. That I think dates it horribly. Because it is so reminiscent of so much other satire that was around at the time. Just taken to a much more ludicrous extreme, that it becomes offensive. It becomes offensive to watch, it becomes offensive to read, and so I'm really glad that Newman is very, very different in the show. She's very she is inspired by a politician still. You could see that she's very much inspired by sort of the Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez and her sort of generation of young congresswomen and senators. The squad, I think they're called in American politics. And you can see that, but it's also... not quite as terrible of a parody. So I'm fine with that. But yeah, I do think that making the boys the underdogs, taking them away from the feds, the CIA, giving them no powers, giving them really few resources. Like they end up in an abandoned restaurant at the start of season 1 because they literally have nowhere else to go. Frenchie has his own connections but burns them all. They then get their identities exposed at the start of season 2, which puts them on the run and makes them even more on the back foot until they sort of link up with the CIA and then later on with the Bureau, where they slowly get more power, including their office in the Flatiron building, which is something they have in the comics right from the start. They have an office in the Flatiron building. So yeah, keeping the boys on the outside, keeping them underpowered, keeping them, underdogs, I think really helps to develop them and gives the show a chance to actually develop them as characters rather than weapons. And I think Serge and Kimiko really show that. Like, Frenchie and Kimiko are very, very different in the show, and they are far better for it because they are far more rounded characters. And, Butcher is even more likable. Like, the comic book version of Butcher, he's a complete asshole. Like, he is not someone you want to like. He is absolutely terrible. He's still charismatic and charming and, could sucker you in, but he's horrible at the same time. And you can tell that he is horrible. And it becomes something you don't want to see, you don't want to experience. But the show version, you can sympathise with him a bit more. You can sympathise with them all a bit more. You can see where they're coming from. And yeah, that humanization isn't just something that exists with the boys. It's something that extends to the 7. So, the world of the boys focuses on the Supes, the heroes, the superhumans that are owned by Vought American. Now, in the comics, there are a lot of them. And there are, the main obvious ones are the 7, which are very clearly inspired by the Justice League, as I said earlier. There's also the G-Men and their associated teams, who are based quite heavily on the X-Men, who are getting their own adaptation coming up very, very soon. I believe it's called Gen V, like Generation V. And that's going to be its own spin-off series that's going to be sort of running alongside season 4 of The Boys. And I'm quite excited for that one because the story arc that the G-Men appear in the comics, called We Gotta Go Now, is one of my favourites. It's one of the story arcs I really like. So yeah, I am interested to see that one get done. Regarding the rest of the Supes, like I said, there's so many in the comics. There's Teenage Kicks, there's Payback, there's Super Duper, who again have another great story arc associated with them. And there's Supes all over the world as well. There's a whole load of Russian Supes we get introduced to at one point. Supes all over America. We hear about different teams based in different states. And there's elements of that in the show, but not quite to the same extent, and not all as vast and ridiculous as some of the heroes are shown in the comic. For example, some of the characters in the comics have some very dramatic powers. It's not quite the case in the show. For example, Jack from Jupiter, looks like an alien, and he's a main member of the 7. He's got yellow skin. He looks a bit like the yellow guy from Sin City. And he's part of the story. He is actually adapted in one episode of the Boys series Diabolical, which is the spin-off animated series, because one of the episodes of that series is based far more on the world of the comic book in terms of how Billy and Huey and the other characters all look. And so Jack from Jupiter does appear in that one. That one's actually written by Garth Ennis as well. It's actually one of the more interesting episodes in Diabolical. Diabolical is a bit hit or miss, I think. And although it does have little animated intros from Terror in the start of every episode, and Terror is very underutilized in the show, so I do quite enjoy that, because I like Terror in the comics, because again, he's funny. But anyway, I'm getting off topic. Jack from Jupiter, his powers and his physical depiction might have been too expensive week on week, so he gets replaced with Translucent. And Translucent being a new character, one, he's invisible, so he doesn't even need to be on set half the time. And two, because he's a unique character, he can be killed off, which he is within the first 3 or 4 episodes. So that's a very interesting path to take. And then, we do learn about some of the other superhero teams. Like, we learn that Teenage Kicks is a thing in this world. And A-Train and Popclaw were both former members. Popclaw is a member of Teenage Kicks in the comics, and I think A-Train is mentioned in the comics to have come up from Teenage Kicks to the 7. But they have multiple other members, and they're implied to still be an active super team. Whereas in the show, it's not clear whether they are still an active team, because the only, there are a couple of members besides Popclaw and A-Train that we learn of, like Mesmer. But, and I think Eagle might have been a former member. But they're not the same. And there's no implication that Teenage Kicks is still around. That it's still part of the series. And there are some others, like we do learn about we learn about the Young Americans. We know they exist because, again, Starlight was a member of the Young Americans along with Drummer Boy, who in the show becomes the character of Supersonic and gets a recurring role in Series 3. Which is, again, not something that happens in the comic. I don't think Drummer Boy ever really reappears. There's also multiple other heroes in the comic. Like I said, there's one arc quite early on which focuses on the character Tech Knight, who is basically a mix of Iron Man and Batman, and he's a human who isn't a supe, but associates with supes and has a whole load of the same issues that the supes do. So the boys go after him. But there are supes that only appear in the show. Mesmer is one, Doppelganger is another, Shockwave, who's the other speedster competing with A-Train, Blind Spot, Gecko, Termite, a lot of, even Blue Hawk, a lot of these recurring soup characters only really exist in the world of the show. They're not from the comics at all, which I find very interesting, because there are plenty of soups available from the comics that can be used, but they've chosen, for whatever reason, to use new characters. But I do think that works, because they're able to do quite a lot with them. They don't have to worry about killing off a character who might have an important role later in the series. Some of these... for example, they do a reality show style contest to guess the new superhero member of the 7, and it's very similar to a sort of show like The Bachelor, or like American Idol, where it's like America's Next Hero kind of thing. Very American reality TV show. And one of the characters they introduce in that is a character called Silver Kincaid. Now, in the comics, Silver Kincaid is very similar to, I don't know, Storm, but also kind of Jean Grey, because she's one of the G-Men, so she's very much based on, you know, that type of character from the X-Men. You know, very similar to Jean Grey, especially. But in the show, when she's used for American Hero, they've changed her completely. She's a Muslim hero. And that suggests that if they do use that character in Gen V, they might change something about them. Or they'll go with what they've already introduced. Either one could be interesting. So yeah, I'm excited to see what they do with that. But yeah, I suppose really I should talk about the Seven, and Vought American and the others. Now, actually, before I get to the Seven and Vought American, like I said, I'm going to stick with the lower heroes and how they are humanized. Popclaw, for example, a former member of Teenage Kicks, they've built a whole world around the Supes in this that sort of makes reference to a lot of superhero media culture. Well, media culture in general, but especially superhero media culture. Vought American in the show is shown to have... excuse me. Vought American in the comics is shown to use the medium of comic books to publicise its superheroes. In fact, the character of the Legend, who does appear in Series 3, played by Paul Reiser, and I think he does a fantastic job playing the Legend. The Legend does appear in the comic book. In fact, he's a more of a recurring role in the comic book, and he seems to... I'm not sure who directly inspired him, but I don't think it's a particularly flattering depiction, let's put it that way. You know, I think elements of his appearance and mannerisms are based on Stan Lee, but yeah, it's not a particularly flattering depiction if that's the case. And the Legend is a guy who used to be hired by Vought, and he runs their comic book line. So he knows all the histories of all the heroes, the true stories and the fake stories that are peddled to the masses. So the boys use him as a source of information. And there's elements of that in Season 3 when the Legend actually appears. But in the show, this Legend is the former Vice President of Hero Management at Vought. And, you know, he was replaced by Stillwell and Edgar, who I'll get to in a bit. But yeah, he claims to have been involved with numerous celebrities and heroes, but again, he still knows things about them. And, you know, it's a very different take than the comic version, and it's because the comic version used the Legend and the comics that he created to publicise the heroes, because at the time The Boys was written, that's how superheroes existed. And I don't know if that's Garth Ennis particularly satirising superhero comic books, or just a lack of perhaps realising how far-reaching real-life superheroes would be. I'm reminded of how in Watchmen, Alan Moore replaced superhero comics with pirate comics, using the logic that in a world that has had superheroes, or costumed adventurers at the very least, and then outlawed them, superheroes wouldn't be popular. And so comic book entertainment would take on a different form. And I don't think the boys in the comics realised just how much this had the potential to infiltrate the media, because the Supes are not just superheroes. They are, there is the whole marketing machine that creates the story. One good example, which I'll get to, is Herogasm, which is obviously very, very different in the comic book. But while there's this story and this marketing machine, they're also celebrities. And, this is seen quite early on with, like, the first few scenes of the show, where we see them come to the rescue. They stop some criminals, they save some people, and then they pose for photos and they're seen through the media. These are film stars. They have, they appear in their own films. They appear as themselves, telling their own stories. They appear in news stories and biopics and reality TV shows. And all sorts of other things besides. And we see that throughout the entire course of this show. The way it handles and satirizes the media and, incorporates the heroes into a media world, I think is great. And Popclaw is one of the first ones that we see this with, because, a lot of the lower heroes that aren't popular enough to be in the Seven, they still have powers. They've still got to find their way in this world. And Popclaw, I think, is one of the examples of one who maybe hasn't found her place to fit in. Whereas some of the others, like Mesmer and Gecko, are some that perhaps have. And I'll come to that. So Popclaw, was revealed to have done some nude modelling in the past, because she has this framed photo of herself naked on her wall, which her landlord then leers over. But she lives in, like, a small apartment in New York. And obviously, I know apartments in New York cost a freaking bomb, so she's obviously paid quite good money for this apartment, but it's not a penthouse apartment, it's just a standard New York brownstone. And, she's not part of a superhero team. She had films, but they weren't very successful. And they sort of played up on a sort of dangerous, sexy persona. So obviously that's how people treat her, but that's how her landlord views her especially. But it's clear from her interactions with A-Train and with the boys that that's not her persona. It's all part of the manufactured image. Mesmer, for example, is another one. He was a child when he developed his powers and was in a television series called Mesmer. And it's one of those, his powers being very, I mean, I know powers are real in this, but obviously they would have to fake them in a way that they're safe and things like that. And his powers were the sort of powers that you would have seen on TV in the 80s anyway. So the fact it's, the 80s, the 90s, the 2000s, so the fact it's Haley Joel Osment playing him as well, which is great bit of casting. Playing this former child star who, goes around the convention circuit hawking his merchandise from his old TV show years ago, who's not really done anything since because he's a former child star. And how that brings him into the world of the boys. I thought that was very interesting, and Mesmer himself is a great character, and I think they use him very, very well in the show. He appears in season 1. I quite like him. I think he's a good addition. Gecko is a minor character in season 2, and I thought his appearance was very interesting. He's the guy who is selling... He regrows parts of himself. So he's sort of selling himself as, like... not necessarily, like, sex work, but also not sex work. There's definitely an element of S&M to it, and a lot of you know, it's a very bizarre experience where he'll allow people to, like, cut parts of him off in exchange for money. And he'll meet them at, like, seedy hotel rooms to do it. And, like, this office guy, like, cuts off his arm and then says, you know, pay me extra, I'll let you cut off my dick. And he does that too. It's such a bizarre character. I kind of really like his inclusion. I think it's an interesting one to kind of show sort of how bizarre this world is, how characters can fit into it. You know, and that sort of stuff is so interesting to me. You know, I love world building. I'm a sucker for it. And, you know, having these realistic heroes exist in a real world where elements are paid to everything about them. Like, how do these people have a day-to-day life? What do they do in their day-to-day life? You know, even things like Termite shrinking down and using his abilities while shrunk to do sexual things to people. You know, and what that does for him. And then obviously the accident that leads to in season 3 when he reappears, because he gets like a brief cameo in the club in season 1. And then doesn't reappear again until season 3. But when he does reappear in season 3, yeah, it's it's one of the most dramatic reappearances of a character. But yeah, you know, that's a weird, realistic application of superpowers. And it's not even the first time I've even seen shrunken powers used that way. Because frickin' Marvel did it. You know, Marvel did it years ago. They had Hank Pym and Janet get back together after being estranged for years. And yeah, that was one of the sort of saucy panels that happened, where Hank came up from underneath the sheets in his tiny form, naked and wet, and said, okay, your turn now. So, you know, this is also, it's stuff that's been done before, but actually getting to see it in the way that you see it on The Boys is very different. So yeah, that's the minor heroes. What about the big heroes? So the big heroes are the 7. And I've already kind of touched on Translucent. Translucent's pretty much a non-character. I will say, despite the fact they are called the 7, there is not 7 of them for most of the show. You know, the main characters are Homelander, Queen Maeve, A-Train, The Deep, Starlight, Stormfront, technically, and I think that's pretty much it. There's also Translucent and Lamplighter, but, you know, Lamplighter's stuff is more plot-related, so I'll get to that in a bit. And, like I said, Translucent created for the show and killed off. So, you know, Starlight is brought up to replace Lamplighter. Oh, and Black Noir, of course. How can I forget Black Noir? So, yeah, I think when Stormfront gets added, they kind of round out to 7, but by that point the Deep is already gone. So it's not the 7 anymore, because they have to replace the Deep and Translucent. But they don't. They only manage to replace one of them with Stormfront. And then Stormfront's gone by the end of season 2. And then by the end of season 3, Starlight's left as well, as so is Queen Maeve. So I don't know what they're going to do come season 4. So again, there's a lot of differences there. But the heroes themselves, I mean, in the comics, these characters are despicable. The Deep is actually a weird one. The Deep doesn't get a lot of development in the comics. In fact, the deep is just kind of there. Like, his main inciting incident in the show, specifically the sexual assault and rape that he does to Starlight, that doesn't happen. Well, it does happen in the comic, but it's not the Deep that does it. The Deep isn't even involved in that scene. The scene is a lot worse in the comic. Don't get me wrong, it is a lot worse. It's Homelander who does it, and then Black Noir and A-Train walk in and join in. So, yeah, the rape is a lot worse. And I will say the rape is one thing that Garth Ennis has come out and said he regrets about the series. I'll give the man his due. He says he regrets it, but the reason he says he regrets it is because of the direction that he took Annie later on. Starlight, Annie January. He says the direction that he took her later on, that feels like way too much to throw on her very early on. And I kind of get that, but that also seems like a really weak excuse. How about just not having that level of sexual assault of a main character? But again, I'll come to that in a bit, because I do think that, again, the show handles it better because of what they do in the aftermath. Starlight isn't really used in the same way in the comic as she is in the show. She's sort of our main insight into the Seven for a lot of the time, but yeah, Annie, there's a lot different about Annie, and especially Annie and Huey's relationship, so I'll get to that in a bit. But the other heroes, I'll save the Homelander and Black Noir for a minute, because their differences are very plot intensive. So A-Train. A-Train in the comic is a dick. Like, he is not a nice person. After the rape on Starlight, he continually mocks her until Homelander, beats him down. And just basically, what Homelander does in season 3, when he tells A-Train he's getting fat, imagine that. But more violent. That's what he does to A-Train. And this is in, issue 3. And yeah, he's A-Train in the comic is awful. He hangs around with Jack from Jupiter, and again, A-Train and Jack are, Jack is not a nice person. A-Train is not a nice person. They smoke. There's one scene in the comic, I think I've mentioned it before on this podcast, where they smoke drugs that involves ground up fetuses, laced with the drugs. They're just unnecessarily cartoonishly awful. And it makes them kind of non-characters. You can't say that about A-Train in the show. A-Train in the show is very much a character. He is, a protagonist of the story in some respects. He, not the lead protagonist, obviously, but, in an ensemble cast, he is a character that you're interested in and care about. We reveal his addiction to Compound V, his determination to stay fast because he's worried that he's going to be replaced, and the fact that Shockwave challenges him to the race, and he has to, keep improving his speed. And then, of course, the damage from the drugs he's taking, the Compound V, what he's doing to himself, and how that affects his health, and then going through his rebrand in season 3, it's all very clever stuff. Even his dedication to sort of hunt down Kimiko because of what she knows and how it can affect him. Even things like him forgetting Huey show just how absorbed he is in this world. but there's elements with A-Train where I don't think he's nowhere near as terrible as his comic book counterpart. You know, there's parts of him that are young and reckless and stupid, but he is not like his comic book counterpart. He's not evil. He's not cartoonishly cruel. The Deep is another one. Like I said, Deep in the comic books is pretty much a non-character, which means that they were able to take a character who, you know, I think he wears a diving suit, like an old-style diving bell suit, for pretty much the entire run. He doesn't really get any development, and he's... You know, like I said, because he's a non-character, they actually use him and develop him in the show. And in fact, he gets some pretty meaty story arcs in every season, but especially season 1 and season 2. Season 1 with the, obviously his rape on Starlight, which is awful. And, I don't want to, I'm not trying to excuse anything of that. But then after that's, as part of the lead up to that being confronted, he also just makes a load of exceedingly stupid decisions that result in him getting his own comeuppance when someone basically rapes him as well. They do things to him that he does not want to happen and that hurt him. Let's point that out. Like, she's molesting his gills on his chest and gaining sexual pleasure from it. And it's hurting him. Like, it's physically hurting him. So he is being raped back. And, it puts him into the position of the victim, of realising what he'd done. And, part of me watching that was like, good. But also, in the lead up to that, he just has a run of bad luck, and some of it is bloody funny. Like the scene with the dolphin in season 1, I laughed out loud so hard. I was gone. I had to pause the show for like 5 minutes the first time I watched that, because I could not stop laughing. Because as much as I didn't want the dolphin to die, it was the fact that the Deep was trying to do something good, and then he just had, like, he's trying to save a dolphin because the dolphin is kept in the cage and made to do tricks and things like that. But instead, this dolphin is randy for the Deep. Like, the dolphin is in love with him. So the Deep has been fucking the dolphin. The dolphin now really wants the Deep, which is so messed up. And then, of course, he's talking about how they're going to run away, and he starts making all these false promises to the dolphin, like, yeah, of course, babe, no problem, babe, like that. And then gets stopped by the police, brakes hard, the dolphin goes sailing through the window, and the look on the dolphin's face, I lost it. The dolphin, as it sails past him through the window, looks at him like, what the hell, bro? And he's gone. He's out the window. I was gone. And same again with the lobster later on, after he gets shunted off to, I've forgotten where it is he ends up, but it's like Bumblefuck, Missouri or something like that. It's like arse end of nowhere, no water for 100 miles. Just, one of those places in small town America that's like in between everywhere else. He's not in New York anymore, put it that way. The last place you would put an ocean hero, and it's because he's just been demoted because of what happened with the dolphin, as well as Starlight going public with the rape. And, he's at his lowest ebb, and he makes friends with a lobster in the supermarket, and the guy takes the lobster out to give it because he wants to buy the lobster, so he's got a friend because he can talk to fish and like sea creatures. And so the guy thinks, the guy behind the counter takes it out as though he wants to eat the lobster, so kills it. And it was just so quick, and between that and his face, like the actor's face as the Deep, or he just did a proper like, crap face. Again, I lost it again. And you know, it's turning the Deep into a character and a punching bag, and a deserved punching bag, because parts of the show are dark. Like, the show is a lot funnier than the comic. The comic is brutally dark in places, but the show is not necessarily, not ever lighthearted. But I think there's parts of season 1 that are quite tense, and having that punching bag for the Deep is, it's needed at points, because it is fine to laugh at him because he's awful and useless, and we do not like him. You know, and a lot of these scenes are in some quite tense episodes. You know, episodes where there's quite dark stuff going on in a couple of them. And then season 2, he has this whole plot where he ends up being part of a church, like this cult-style Scientology, ridiculous Republican megachurch. Oh, God. Yeah, screw the Deep. He's awful. You know, and they try and redeem him and bring him back onto the Seven in season 3. And, yeah, I still hate him. Screw him. He's awful. Just let him be the punching bag, because it's so much more fun. So that's A-Train, that's the Deep. Queen Maeve is the next big member of the Seven. Like I said, I'm going to discuss Starlight later on. I'll probably discuss Stormfront when we get to plot stuff. But, you know, I've got a whole big thing coming on Starlight in a minute. But yeah, let's talk about Queen Maeve. Queen Maeve in the comics is very jaded. Like, so done. She is so done with everything. The whole culture. She's drinking herself blind drunk most of the time. Just chain smoking like a chimney. She has no interest, no compassion left. And there's elements of that right at the start with the comic version, although not quite as extreme as with the show version, but not quite as extreme as the comic book version, because she bonds quite quickly with Starlight. She actually approaches her and offers her some counsel and some guidance and some insight into her own life and what led her to where she is. Like Starlight mentions how she, this rescue that Maeve did when she was younger, and how she now knows, now that she's part of the system, that was probably all just made up by the marketing guys, despite the fact it was something in Maeve's biography that she read over and over and was like, I want to be like that. And then Maeve reveals, no, that was actually real. And, you start to see a more compassionate side to Maeve, and she's not quite as... She hasn't had all of the spirit quite drummed out of her yet. And that leads to her developing more as a character. We see her relationship, her former lover, who then comes back into the series with her. Her former girlfriend, Elena. It's because Homelander finds out about her and outs her, because, again, Homelander's awful. And that's, what leads to these changes. in her. And, you know, she tries to follow a certain, not path really, but, you know, she tries to take a more proactive approach. You know, sort of surrounded by Elena, and she starts helping the boys, for example. But none of that lasts. And because of what happens at the end of series 3. And, you know, Homelander's manipulations in season 2 and how that leads to Elena being driven away. It's all quite sad. Maeve in the comics in the show, is a very tragic character. You know, much more so than in the show. In the show, keep getting the show and the comic confused. She's a much more tragic character in the show than she ever was in the comic. In the comic, she is way too jaded. But that's not the case in the show. In the show, she can be brutal at times, like really brutal. There's some amazing put down she has, and she really seems to hate Huey. Like she will lay into Huey for the slightest reason, pretty much any time they're on screen together. But yeah, she's very different, and then, you know, she's involved in both of the confrontations at the end of season 2 and the end of season 3 on the side of the boys. And she gets some great fight scenes where she's really, like, standing up for herself and fighting Homelander. Like, some of her battles with Homelander are great. And, you know, none of that's really in the comics. Her development in this way is not in the comics. Not like this. And it's just a joy to see because she's really good in the show. And I don't think they've announced yet if she's going to be returning for season 4. Because she does seem to have been, like, conclusively written out of the show. But it is still possible that she could return. And I don't know. I'd be intrigued to see what happens. Black Noir and Homelander then. Homelander in the show is... At first, he seems more heroic. Like, he does. One of his first scenes is, you know, besides the rescue that opens the show, one of his first scenes is them all with the meeting of the Seven, and he says, you know, who have you saved? And that seems very much like how early comic book Homelander is presented. The difference is the boys in the show are just starting out, or at least not just starting out because they were previously a thing. But I don't think Homelander ever realised who they were. Whereas in the comic, Homelander knows who Butcher is and knows about the boys because in the first story arc, he leaks their identity to Teenage Kicks, suggesting that he knew about them. And, you know, Homelander in the comics is a very muddled character. And there's only so much I can say about Homelander and Black Noir without spoiling huge chunks of the comics, which I don't want to do. But yeah, essentially, there's a reason why Homelander is messed up in the comics. There's a real definitive arc for Homelander in the comics. And Black Noir is linked to it. And and it explains so much about Homelander. And Homelander in the comics is presented as a lot more twisted. You know, he's just as hair trigger violent as he is in the show, but a lot more twisted in terms of the things that he is capable of doing, or seemingly capable of doing. You know, that's actually part of the story arc for it all. In the show, his evolution in the show is very interesting. And I think it's incredibly... I don't want to say relatable. It is relatable to an extent in that you can see why Homelander is the way he is. But I don't think you should relate to him on any level. You know, and there are people that do. There are people that have totally missed the memo that Homelander is the bad guy. Like, he is the bad guy. This is explicit. He is not a nice person. You know, he shoots down a whole plane in the end of season 1. Like, did people just... end of episode 1. Like, did people forget that? You know, he shot down a plane because a senator wouldn't agree to something that Vought was offering them. And he shot down a whole plane full of innocent people. And then we're shocked that he suggests later on leaving the hijacked flight and leaving everyone on it to die. You know, like, that's meant to be a huge shock. The only difference there that made it shocking was that Maeve was there, and Maeve was begging him to save people. So yeah, Homelander is very dark. Black Noir in the show is, for most of the show, an element of comic relief and just kind of there. But he really gets fleshed out in season 3 of the show. And everything that happens in season 3 is unique to Black Noir in the comics. In the show, sorry. It is not an element of the comic storyline at all. And in fact, you know, for anyone who's seen season 3, that version of Black Noir does not survive. The same actor is going to be playing a new Black Noir in the next series. And so I'm wondering if that version will skew closer to the comic book counterpart. But I don't think they need to, because Homelander in the show is heading in a very, very similar direction to the comic book counterpart. Like, in fact, a very similar direction and a lot quicker, but without the justification that the comic book counterpart had for it. And so I don't think they necessarily need to adapt that storyline with Homelander and Black Noir. And if you've read the comic, you know what I'm on about. If you haven't read the comic, hopefully I'm keeping it vague enough that you know that these two characters are linked, but you don't know what the story is. Because it's part of a very good twist, actually, and a very good storyline. So yeah, Black Noir is very good in the show, and you know, he gets his main bit of development in season 3, specifically with the, you know, the cartoons that he sees in his head, which reveal his history with Soldier Boy. And yeah, that's very interesting. You know, revealing that his history with Payback, and, you know, and how his history with Soldier Boy and Payback and what that did to him. and Payback are very, very different in the show anyway, which again I'll get to. But yeah, it was dark exploring that, and I think doing it through cartoons was a great stylistic choice on the part of the creators. I think they did a brilliant job in how they depicted the history of Payback. I think, yeah, it was a lot of fun, that episode, despite some of the pathos that was going on in it. And then how Homelander killed him. You know, someone up until then that he'd considered a really close friend. Like, Black Noir was one of his closest allies. And, you know, Black Noir is a great character and a real threat in Series 1 and Series 2. Like, the fight with Kimiko, the battle with Butcher and the others sort of shows just how powerful and how terrifying he is. And humanizing him in that way and turning him from just a weapon, which is how he'd been depicted at that up until that point, into Irving, and showing just how vulnerable Irving was. I thought that was great, and one of the best things that season 3 did. So I'm very intrigued to see who the second Black Noir is going to be and what they are going to do with the character. I'm hoping they come up with something just as unique and interesting. And I love the idea of rebranding a hero. So, yeah, you know, they do make mention that A-Train's name might be given to Shockwave if Shockwave came up in season 2. So, you know, the whole idea of rebranding a hero, it's sort of a reference to legacy comic book characters. I do quite like it. I thought that was a nifty little twist. So, I've done the boys. I've done the Supes. Let's start looking at the plot, and specifically two of the major characters, Starlight and Huey. So from my perspective, Starlight and Huey are empowered so much as our lead characters in The Boys. In the comics, they do end up in a relationship, and like I said, Huey is the main character. But Starlight, Annie, doesn't get a huge amount to do for large portions of it. She's essentially our window into Supe life. But, you know, like I said earlier, Garth Ennis didn't plan on the relationship between Huey and Annie. It was something that just sort of happened because they were both in the park together and they interacted. And, you know, he was hoping to sort of contrast the two of them and their journeys. But instead, they ended up together. And, you know, their relationship builds without them telling each other who they are. Like, neither of them are aware of each other's identity. They become aware as the series goes on. And in fact, you know, Butcher, due to cameras they've got placed inside the Vort's tower, finds out everything about what happened to Annie. And like I said, in the comics, her rape was much more dramatic and featured Homelander, Black Noir, and A-Train. And, you know, he learns about that and then drops it on Huey at an opportune time purely to manipulate Huey, because Butcher is way more manipulative in the comics than he is in the show. And especially has a much greater control of Huey. And a lot of the writing that ensues from that is not necessarily problematic, but I'm not as comfortable with it as I think I would have been at the time. Times have changed, attitudes have moved on, and some of the ways that Huey behaves towards Annie off the back of it are quite toxic and doesn't really take into account what she has gone through and the trauma that she has endured, because she was raped. And so, yeah, while Huey is developed, Annie is left as this really passive character in the comic, to the point it becomes annoying. She doesn't even get much agency towards the end of the comic with everything that happens there. It's, her agency comes about because she's spurred on by Maeve. Like, when she goes to things like Herogasm, she's just kind of there. She's a passive observer. And it becomes kind of infuriating. In some parts of the comic especially, it becomes very infuriating. I think the most active thing she does is during the miniseries Highland Laddie, where, Huey leaves the team and returns home to Scotland and encounters Mallory for the first time, because Mallory is, like, watching him in Scotland and sort of helps him get back on task, and Annie chases him down, which is quite sweet. The show, though, the show does wonders with Annie especially, but also with Huey. They both learn each other's identities very early on. Like, he works out who she is, that she's Annie January, before their relationship really develops. And yes, he does use her through his position with the boys, like, for example, at the Believe Expo, where he uses her to get access to Ezekiel so that they can blackmail him. But her stand at the Believe Expo, where she reveals what happened to her publicly on TV, exposes the Deep for what he is, after putting up with some of the things that have already happened to her, like her costume change. The costume change that she has in the show, the costume change in the comic is worse. It's done by Homelander. He just literally comes up to her with a Sharpie marker and draws this, like, cutout on her chest, and just says, yeah, we'll fix your costume with that. It's a real dehumanizing moment, and made even worse by what he did already. It being part of the marketing team in this, is a different kind of satire, and it works better in terms of how the superheroes are presented in this. They're very media controlled, and the costume change, that's not the only one she goes through in the comic. Like, they propose basically a gold bikini at one point, and that's when she loses it and takes a stand against them and goes back to her. I don't think she goes back to her original costume, but she goes back to the medium one. And in this, she's given the costume, but she stands again. She's all meek about it until she stands up at Believe, and then Huey acknowledges that and mentions, it strengthens their relationship. He comes clean to her about stuff and how he's been using her and how he's been dealing with Robin, and I love it. I thought it was a great scene in a great episode. And then how that leads to, Starlight saving another woman from being raped and getting caught on camera, but not caring, because it becomes really popular. And, she doesn't care, and then it becomes really popular. She stands up against Ashley, like, well, what else was I supposed to do? How she stands up against Stillwell. It's very good, and I think... And that's all just in season 1. Like, her progression from then through season 2, there are a few missteps, like she gets very taken in by Stormfront's persona, but I think that's understandable because of how Stormfront was playing her. Like, Stormfront's very intelligent in the show. Stormfront in the comic is a bit more of a brute. But yeah, Stormfront in the show is very canny. And I think she manipulates Starlight. And then, of course, how Starlight uses... How that backfires on Stormfront when Starlight comes to fight her at the end. And, you know, stands with the boys. And then, obviously, everything that leads to in Season 3, where, you know, she's being open with Huey. She's got Huey on her arm. And then she's, you know, actively helping the boys and Huey and the Bureau, while also still standing against Homelander, because Homelander's really starting to go off the rails. And yes, she makes some missteps, like things go wrong with Supersonic, for example, but she's trying to make a stand until she's just beaten down by realizing that she can't. Like, Homelander's control is so pervasive by the end of season 3 that she has no option but to leave. And even when she leaves, she creates, you know, divisiveness. She's not going quietly into the night. She is standing against him, you know, using a platform, using her influence. So yeah, Starlight's changes are huge, and they're so tied into the plot. She is a much more active participant in the plot. Like, she comes back and saves the boys at the end of season 1. She comes and saves them from Vought. Brilliant. You know, she is so active in every season. And yes, her and Huey's relationship goes a bit up and down, but I think it's so good. You know, and the development between them is incredible. And this is just like one part of the plot change. Like, there's so many things changed in the plot of the show from the comics. Like, the whole idea of the Compound V being smuggled abroad. I don't think that's in the comic. From what I remember, they use... Vought is using the character of Little Nina, who does appear in season 3, to get soups into Russia. Like, she's helping create Russian soups, including Love Sausage, Vas, who appears in season 2 and season 3 in, like, brief cameos. But he's like one of their soups who's an ally, and he helps them during a whole mission in Russia. You know, for anyone who's forgotten who Love Sausage is, the dude with the prehensile penis. The Flight 37 incident doesn't happen in the comics. Instead, it's centered around 9/11. Basically, Vought is trying to, you know, in a similar way to in the show, they are trying to get the soups into the military. You know, Vought in the comics is explained as a company that originally created guns for World War II, but they were awful. Like, they created guns and munitions that broke and didn't fire and, you know, had tons of problems. So now they're creating superhumans. And, you know, they're trying to put those soups in the weapon. They're trying to get those military contracts. And, you know, this was off the back of 9/11 and, you know, the start of the Iraq War. We were seeing things like Halliburton and how much they were profiting off of this war. Like, this was definitely something that was out in the zeitgeist and in the news and that we were all aware of. And because in the comics, Vought is controlling Vic the Veep, and, you know, they have influence around him and the people around him, and they're trying to undermine the actual president, Dakota Bob, who is a Republican in the comics. He's, in the world of the comics, I think he's he's Bush Sr.'s former vice president. And so he succeeded Clinton, in a similar way to how Biden succeeded Trump. He didn't stand and then returned. And yeah, they get rid of Dakota Bob, have 3 of the planes at 9/11 shot down, I believe, and then the 7 try and intercept the last one. And it goes so wrong. Like, they are completely untrained. They are really ineffectual. I think one of them might actually die, because I don't think they had quite the same membership. I think there was an extra person there, possibly, or Lamplighter got injured or something like that. And the plane didn't hit the towers, but it did destroy the Brooklyn Bridge, when it came down. So the Flight 30, that's the inciting incident in the show, in the comics, that Flight 37 is a direct allegory for. And, the video that Maeve has that she threatens Homelander with that can sort of expose the truth about Flight 37 is very similar to it's very similar to the files that the boys are able to get hold of explaining what happened at 9/11. But, the Supes in the Army is still a plotline. The terrorists thing isn't, as far as I'm aware. At least I really do not recall that being a plot thread. So it goes in hand with the Compound V smuggling. It's not part of the plot, but I think it was used very well in the show because, again, the original story was written during a time of, post 9/11 war profiting, that sort of the post 9/11 environment that we had. The modern day, we're not actively at war with anyone. Well, say that. Britain and America don't actively have troops anywhere at the minute. Obviously there's the situation going on in Ukraine and other things like that. But it's not quite to the same extent that it is in the comic. In the time of the comic, where you've got the Iraq War, Afghanistan. Although, in the comics, they don't invade Afghanistan. After 9/11, Dakota Bob actually invades Pakistan, because that's where Al-Qaeda was trained. It's a very different alternate history. In fact, Dakota Bob is far more capable than Bush ever was. And so, the world that we have now is very much, the terrorism of today is small terror cells and small insurgents in embattled countries around the world. Groups like ISIS, like Boko Haram. And so that is the sort of world that these super terrorists are trying to tap into. It is a plotline that kind of goes away after sort of season 2, and I think that's because the domestic plot really starts to heat up. Because, they use it for some good things in season 2, but it's very much a plot for season 1. And then in season 2, the way they use it is by having Homelander be shown, essentially committing a war crime, committing a war atrocity, by being just as reckless over there as he is over here, and it means he kills innocent people. And it's televised, and it's used as an example of why the Supes shouldn't be doing the things that they're doing. And it's a very clever decision to make, because, again, each of these seasons is almost a product of their time, in as much as the same way as the comics are. Season 1 came out in 2019, which means it was being filmed in 2017, when it was being filmed and scripted. And so, making those decisions about worldwide terror made sense for how the world was at the time. Season 2 was September 2020. I think it was delayed a bit due to COVID. But, it would have been being worked on after season 1, 2019. So, the world had slightly moved on. Not much, but slightly moved on. And we were aware of, we've had things showing, disastrous things abroad, but, phones capturing, our law enforcement officers or our soldiers doing horrible things. Not just our soldiers or law enforcement officers, but, others as well. Committing horrible atrocities. And that instantly being uploaded to the internet. That's something we'd started to see. So, of course, it was something that, they worked into the show. And I thought it worked really well. And then, obviously, season 3 was very much delayed by COVID. It only really came out last year. 2022. So that would have been worked on during COVID. So, it's taken a different approach by sort of focusing on the domestic stuff by distancing itself from that. So yeah, the terrorists thing kind of goes away, but it's not a bad thing that it does, I don't think. There's other plot lines that are drastically different as well. Stormfront, like I said, is hugely different. In the comics, Stormfront is male and is a member of Payback. He's never actually promoted to the Seven. He is horrifically brutal, and is basically the de facto leader of Payback. And just like in the show, he is a complete Nazi. And he has, utter contempt for his teammates. The show version, portrayed brilliantly by Aya Cash, she is much better done. Her history as Liberty Bell, I think, is not Liberty Bell, that's a DC character. Liberty, I think, is great. I think it's very interesting. And the way she goes up against the boys and Maeve and Starlight, and especially the way they handle her racism, because they tie her into a lot of alt-right talking points and, the media campaigns and meme farms and bots and it's so good. It's a brilliant piece of satire that tapped into a lot of things that by 2020 we were seeing. This stuff is the sort of stuff that got Donald Trump elected, that saw the rise of the Proud Boys, that is fueling alt-right movements around the globe. And it tapped in and made a perfect parody of that. Brilliantly. And I thought it was absolutely biting satire and done in a way that is much better than in the comic. Stormfront's only real... I suppose Stormfront's biggest Nazi thing in the comics is it's revealed that Stormfront destroyed the levees in Hurricane Katrina and flooded New Orleans. Trying to he was trying to ethnically cleanse the city. Which is incredibly disturbing, but but Stormfront's main impact in the comics is that they use Stormfront's DNA to create the Homelander. That's not the case in the show. In the show, they use Soldier Boy, who is very, very different. But yeah, I think yeah, I think Stormfront is much better done in the show. Um, and there's a mystery to her in the show that I think is a lot more fun. Um, I've already touched as well on some of the bigger plot changes, like Becca and Ryan. Um, Becca is, I know she does die by the end of season 2, but she is long dead in the comic. And, you know, pretty much anything with her and Ryan is completely unique to the show. And I'm finding it so interesting, seeing where it's going. Kimiko's brother Kenji as well, not a part of the comic. So everything regarding him in season 2, completely unique to the show. The public learning about Compound V, I don't think I don't recall there ever being a big public announcement about Compound V and about the creation of superheroes. But it's definitely an open secret among the characters in the comic. The boys and the CIA all know about Compound V. There are, street drugs laced with Compound V that allowed sex workers to keep up with superheroes, although it's revealed that quite a lot of them do still die. Like during Herogasm, it's mentioned that quite a few of the sex workers they've hired for that will end up dead. Which is, yeah. So yeah, the public learning about Compound V, and I don't know how many of the heroes know about Compound V either. Like, I think some of them in the comics still believe the origin stories that they've been fed in the same way that Starlight did in the show, which is quite cool. Lamplighter is incredibly different. His whole return and, his whole thing at the mental asylum where he's working for Stormfront, which, again, none of that in the comic. Lamplighter, he was given to... he was sort of beaten by the Seven and turned over to the CIA, almost as like a peace offering after what he did to Mallory's grandchildren. In an attempt to kind of end their conflict, like a peace offering. And obviously the public story is that he's taken a hiatus from the team. But, that's not the case. There turns out to be a very good revelation with the Lamplighter in the comics, which is dark, but Lamplighter is a very interesting and kind of a tragic figure almost in the show. He's played by Shawn Ashmore, who I think does a brilliant job, and he works in the hospital. He's been, he's pyrokinetic, but he requires the source of fire, which I think in the comics he could actually create the fire himself. And yeah, it turns out that he turned on the Seven and started working with the CIA and stuff like that. But then he also tried to kill Mallory. I think Mallory was blackmailing him. So he tried to kill Mallory, and that's when he killed her grandchildren, which he didn't want to do. And we find out that Frenchie was assigned to follow him. Frenchie had to leave because of his friend overdosing. And, Lamplighter kind of realised and has been living with this guilt ever since. And... they get Lamplighter to testify in the Supreme Court about everything that he's been doing, but then he still decides to go back to, the Vought Tower and kill himself. And yeah, it's there's a real tragic element to Lamplighter in the show. And a lot of it is on him. Like, it happened because he is a nasty piece of work. But yeah, it's intriguing. Let's see, what else haven't we discussed? Newman, I mentioned already, and how she founds the Bureau, and how she's also being used as the adaptation for Vic the Veep. And obviously, she's very different to Vic the Veep. Everything they're doing with her. Like, I think as the presidential election with Dakota Bob and Newman on the ticket, who Dakota Bob is a Democrat in the show as well. I think that's going to be plot thread for season 4. And again, Newman is a very different character in the show. The concept of V24, I don't think it's a temporary V that they use in the comics. If it is, it's never really spelled out. It's kind of implied that once Butcher injects Huey in, the first story arc, that he has those powers. Like, because he makes jokes about, careful not to tear your cock off when you have a wank. There are some characters at Vought themselves that are completely different in the show as well. Stillwell is Madeline Stillwell in the show, and she's dead by the end of season 1. I think she's brilliant, and I think her relationship with Homelander is very good, and especially the way he's trying to deal with that afterwards by using Doppelganger. That's very clever. And she's very shrewd in the show. She's perfectly shrewd, and a savvy businessman. But she's very different to the comic book version of Stillwell. The comic version of Stillwell, I don't think he's even named for a large portion of the comic. He's just referred to as the Vought guy. He is so unflappable and calm and very measured. Everything he says or does is so controlled. And, and there's some great stuff in his story arc with how much of a long game he is planning and involved in, and like the character of Ashley in the show has sort of taken over Madeline's old role, and she's losing her hair and things like that, and elements of that are from the comic. Like, there is an Ashley in the comic, and she does start losing her hair due to stress. I think she actually starts ripping it out in a similar way to the show, but it happens much later, and she's given a position by Stillwell and manipulated by Stillwell. And Stillwell essentially has Edgar's position in the comic. In fact, the show version of Edgar is much more similar to the comic book version of Stillwell than Madeline is. And I think that's by design. But like I said, Stillwell is a very ever-present character throughout the comic run, right up until the end, whereas Edgar seems to have almost been ousted from Vought and removed from the show. How long that will last, I don't know, but it definitely seems to be the case at the minute. Homelander seems to be in control of Vought at the minute. Off the back of his announcement and the way that Newman has moved against him as well. It's very clever. And like I said, it's so different to the comic. And I love it when things do this. Because obviously, comic adaptations, adaptations of comic books are big things nowadays. And comic books are, like, the comic books themselves aren't necessarily popular, but the stories, the characters are definitely popular. And they have these huge expansive history, and nerds like me follow that history and chronicle that history and look at it online, which means, you know, people can learn everything about these stories at the touch of a button on Google. You know, 5 minutes on Google, you can find out, you know, take the Marvel Universe, you can find out exactly who Kang is. Exactly what Secret Wars is, why it's so important, why nerds are so excited about it. You know, why geeks like me are so looking forward to Kang the Conqueror, and, you know, who all the others are, like Ramatut and Immortus and the Scarlet Centurion. You can learn all that really quickly, really easily. Like, there are videos and articles that break down every post-credit sequence, every plot, every announcement, and what it could possibly mean, and what shape the story could possibly take. The same is true of something like The Boys. And like I said, The Boys is a good story. I still recommend reading the whole series through at least once. But I very much like that it is taking a different direction in the show and is doing things that are surprising me. As someone who has read that entire series and still enjoyed it, despite its flaws, despite the issues I have with it, I still enjoyed it. I really like that it is doing different things. And yeah, I really, really like that. And, you know, doing things like removing the Stillwell allegory in Mr. Edgar really works like that. To create something new and something interesting. Same with Becca and Ryan. And same with, you know, some of the other changes. Like, you know, the fact that Maeve has been, you know, killed off, according to the public, and written out of the show. How Homelander has made his announcement that, again, he makes an announcement very similar to that in the comics, but not on live TV. It's done to the Supes. Specifically to the Supes. And, you know, it's different in a way that's very interesting. You know, and, you know, Soldier Boy was a great example of this. Soldier Boy in the comics is awful. Like, not in the same way that, like, someone like A-Train or Jack from Jupiter is awful, where they're just horrible, disgusting people. Like, Soldier Boy in the comics is pathetic. Like, laughably pathetic. I don't think he's even the first Soldier Boy. He's, like, the third person to have worn the mantle. He allows Homelander to use him for sex, because he's trying to bargain his way into the Seven. So he allows Homelander to do these horrible things to him, because it's implied it's not just sex. There's a very heavy domination aspect and other things like that going on. And hey, not to kink shame, but, you know, it's clear there's a lot of coercion there. You know, there's sex. This happens during Herogasm, by the way, and then Payback become a big thing in the story arc after that with Stormfront and things like that. Herogasm as well is very different in the comics. In the comics, Herogasm is a mini-series, and it starts with, like, Homelander announcing that all of the heroes are having to go off into space, to fly off into space to fight this alien threat that is threatening Earth, and some of them may not return, and the threat is so grave that even their supervillains, who we know by this point are, you know, corporate sponsored in exactly the same way, like all their fights, everything, it's all scripted. You know, and they're having to fly off into space to confront these deadly aliens, and even their supervillains have joined up with them because this is a threat that threatens all of humanity. And then they all fly off and arrive at a tropical paradise island surrounded by half-naked sex workers, with Homelander flying down saying, "All right, everyone, let's fuck." that's the start of Herogasm. It turns out, basically, Herogasm is this event that happens every year. They come up with some big, ridiculous comic book style crossover event to explain what the situation is, and then they just go off and have a week of debauchery. And, you know, the Herogasm that's presented in the show is tame in comparison. It is so tame in comparison to the comic. And, you know, there's a lot more going on. There's a whole, like I said, it's a mini-series. It's not just 6 issues of debauchery. There is a plot going on there. Vic the Veep is involved. The boys are involved. You know, there's a lot going on in that story arc. But it's just the differing worlds make me laugh. And how grand of a thing it is in the comic. Although it does make Deep's, you know, notion that it's like this legendary event when he arrives kind of funny, because it seems like such a quiet underground thing just among the Supes in the show. Like, no, the TNT twins just invite a whole load of their friends round for an orgy. That's not quite what it is in the comic. But anyway, I was talking about Soldier Boy. So yeah, Soldier Boy in the comic is pathetic, and like I said, he's whipped by Homelander. He's bullied and emasculated constantly by Stormfront. So despite the fact he's the leader of Payback, he's terrible. And you know, when he goes up against the boys, I don't think he lasts long. The comic book version of Soldier Boy, oh my goodness. You know, clearly they were typing into an allegory of, like, Captain America. You know, a lot of the Payback characters are inspired by sort of Marvel heroes, like the Crimson Countess being the Scarlet Witch. Also, what they did with the Crimson Countess, making her a cam model, thought, again, that was a great bit of world building, sort of explain, you know, how these characters can find a role in this universe. I thought that was very clever. But yeah, Soldier Boy has been in a Russian prison for several years, and he's been tortured, and he has this ridiculous new explosive power that strips superpowers away from others. And so Butcher decides to use him as a weapon to take out Homelander, but then it's revealed that Soldier Boy's, you know, incredible long life as one of the first successes, and one of the greatest superheroes, means that, you know, his DNA was used for the Homelander, who they realised they could have a lot more control of than they do of Soldier Boy, because Soldier Boy is impulsive and brash, and, you know, he feels like there's the bit in the first Captain America movie where Stanley Tucci's character, Dr. Erskine, says about Steve has been selected because he's a good man, first and foremost, not a good soldier, a good man. Soldier Boy feels like if they'd given that jock soldier the powers, like, what a less Disney-fied version of that character in the actual 1940s would have turned into is Soldier Boy. You know, it's very explicitly a commentary on, you know, modern comics in the MCU, and I love it. And yeah, it's a great change for the story, and I think it works so well. And like I said, I really liked Soldier Boy in the show, and I loved his whole arc, and I loved just how terrible of a person he was. Like, relatable and funny in some respects, but also just horrible and racist and xenophobic and, you know, everything that you know, if you take away the romanticization of The Greatest Generation, if you take all that away, that's the ugly truth of it, is someone like Soldier Boy. And yeah, I just thought he was really well done. And, I've never watched Supernatural. I've not seen much other stuff with Jensen Ackles. I was very impressed with him in this. Did distract me the fact that a lot of the time he sounds like he's doing a Sylvester Stallone impersonation. I don't know if that's his actual speaking voice or if he was putting one on. But yeah, I did notice that, and that did take me out of it at first, but yeah, his performance is good, and his interaction with the boys is good. And yeah, it's a great little twist, and it's not even clear really necessarily if he's completely gone for good or if he could come back. So that could be interesting as well. And I suppose one final thing I want to make clear that's very different from the comic book, at least in terms of how it's been presented. V24, the temporary V that Butcher's been using, he's now dying as a result. Like, he's terminally ill. And that is completely new. And again, like many other things, is promising this bold new direction for the remaining seasons. And I don't think Boys has much longer left. I'd say 2, maybe 3 seasons at most to wrap up the comic book storyline. With the fact they're doing the spin-off like Gen V as well. I don't know how much the actual Boys characters are going to be involved in that. And, there's certain story arcs from the comics. Like, there's a story... I've forgotten what the story is actually called, but it involves a super team... another super team that they send Huey in to be part of. And, again, it's quite charming. It's similar to the G-Men one, where there's elements of it that are quite nice and show that, he's just this Huey is just this nice character and able to bring, make connections with people and bring out good things in people. And so, but they've kind of moved beyond that point in the show, like where that part of the story would intersect. So I don't think they'll be using it. I could be wrong, but yeah, I don't think that element, that story is going to be part of the show. But, I could be wrong. But yeah, either way, I don't think they've got more than about 2 or 3 seasons left before they have to start wrapping it up. And based on the plot threads that are still to come from the comic, those seasons are going to be very, very good. With lots of great twists and turns. Like, The Boys has a great ending as a comic. And, if they use that and they stick the landing with some of the changes that they've made as well, which are taking it in bolder new directions, it could work so well. So yeah, I'm excited to see what they have. But yeah, there's one final thing I want to talk about, and that is the satire and the world building of the show. Right, the definition I've found online for satire is that it's the use of humour, irony, exaggeration, or ridicule to expose and criticise people's stupidity or vices, particularly in the context of contemporary politics and other topical issues. Essentially, it is a way of, taking vices, follies, abuses, shortcomings, holding them up to ridicule, often with the intent of shaming or exposing the flaws or perceived flaws of people, corporations, government, or society itself. And with the goal of trying to get them to improve. Now, obviously a lot of that is linked to irony and sarcasm and exaggeration and comedy, but also, you know, things like parody as well, but also, you know, comparison and analogy. And I think there is a lot of that in The Boys. And a lot of it also ties into, again, something that I've spoken about in this podcast before as something I like, which is world building. You know? This series does so much to expand its world and build it up and make it feel like a lived-in world that just happens to have superheroes. And I've spoken about superhero deconstruction in the past. I spoke about it in the DC episode in season 2. I spoke about it when I was discussing Alan Moore. And, you know, how the superhero deconstruction and how, you know, you had things like the Dark Age of comics, things like Watchmen, Dark Knight Returns, and how they tried to break down superhero media and sort of hold a lens up to it and all the tropes that have sort of infected it and the things that the author was perceiving as wrong with it. And obviously the biggest example of this is Watchmen, and, you know, how that deconstructs superhero media, specifically superhero comics. But, and I think The Boys comic was trying to do that. Like I said, elements of it are very mean-spirited, but it is trying to do something similar, but for the modern age in terms of superhero comics. But, like I said, it just feels cynical in a lot of places. The show, however, back in 2009, Watchmen actually got adapted into a film. It was done by Zack Snyder. Now, whether he was the right choice to direct it or not, I don't know. I think his adaptation is very true to the source material in a lot of respects. Like, some of the elements that I would have thought very tricky to adapt based on reading the actual graphic novel, I think he adapted very, very well. You know, in terms of literally translating them from the comic book page to the screen. And, you know, I do think the ending of that film was perhaps a bit better than the ending in the comic. But the thing is, Watchmen came out in 2009. As I said, Watchmen was a comic deconstruction that came out in 1985. It came out, you know, around about the same time as Crisis on Infinite Earths. DC was doing their big reset with 5 different worlds. Marvel was king of the comic book crown. You know, what Watchmen did to comics was a sensation because comics were massive. What the Watchmen film didn't do that for superhero film. Superhero film in 2008, the MCU had only just started. It had 2 films, Iron Man and The Incredible Hulk. Iron Man was a sensation, Incredible Hulk not so much. DC was in the middle, had just released The Dark Knight, but their last Superman movie was Superman Returns, which was not very well received. Sony had recently released Spider-Man 3, again, not very well received. I think Fox released X-Men Origins Wolverine that year and had recently released both Fantastic Four, Rise of the Silver Surfer, and X-Men 3, The Last Stand. Again, neither of which were particularly well received. And so Watchmen didn't quite hit that zeitgeist in criticising and deconstructing the medium in the way that it perhaps should have, and in the way that the comic book did. The Boys, however, I think is doing its job to deconstruct not just the concept of superheroes, but also the culture that we have built up around superheroes, and specifically superhero media. As I've talked about before, I think the MCU has changed so much in the way that we consume media, in the way that, we talk about film and these connected universes and these characters. And Watchmen, came too early to comment on any of that. And even if it had, that's not the story that it's trying to tell. Watchmen's a period piece. It's set in the 80s. The Boys, though, The Boys has tapped right into that, like immediately into that. The marketing team, the concept of the Make-A-Wish for superheroes, the whole idea of the Vought cinematic universe. They even have a line while filming Dawn of the Seven, which is so obviously referencing Batman v Superman: Dawn of Justice with its very title. But they have a line while they're filming it that, Homelander says, "This latest Joss rewrite really sings, doesn't it?" Which is so obviously a reference to everything that happened with Justice League. There's a VaughtCon. There's superhero porn parodies in the third season. Like the Axel Braun porn parodies under Vivid, they're really good. Like they actually have sex-free cuts on the discs. And Axel Vaughn is clearly a fan of superheroes. He puts some deep cut references in those freaking things. And, the costumes are accurate to the comic books or to the films. Because, yes, I've seen a couple of them. They're pretty good. There's a Vortland, which is similar to the new the Avengers campus that's just launched in Disney World. And this is just in terms of what it's satirizing around the actual celebrity culture of the superheroes and the impact they have on society. That's before you even get into things like the political satire. Like I said, with Stormfront and the alt-right and the memes, the fact that there's a reality show based around American Hero, find the next member of the Seven. So they would have put superheroes in a reality show and had them do tasks together. Maybe had them live together and have cameras filming them the entire time. I'm going to show my age now. The big TV show I remember watching with that format, first of all, was Beauty and the Geek, on Channel 4. But, I think it's very clearly inspired by something like The Bachelor or, other ones like other competitions like that. And it's hitting so much satire that, I'm not completely down with everything, but I like to think of myself as, pretty aware, pretty clued in politically, and, woke, if you want to use that term. I'm a leftist. I'm openly queer. I have, I'm aware of social injustice and things like that. And, I'm also a feminist and what have you. And being aware of all that, while also being a massive geek who obsesses so much about the minutiae of fictional universes, seeing everything in this show that highlights, all these things that I see and can criticize in the real world. Things like the alt-right, things like these, Christian, huge mega churches with, like the Believe Expo that's in the show. There are actual things like that And the group about the abstinence group, Starlight has to lie about when she lost her virginity because she's got to promote abstinence to this group of God-fearing children. While Ezekiel is a closeted gay man, who has to put on this has to put on this performance as this out and proud, Christian, right-wing American Christian. The idea of a superhero support group, the secret sex club, because, there are underground sex clubs like that, swingers clubs and things like that. They're in a lot of towns. They're around. I know people who go to them. It's so clever and so clued in, and then obviously everything about this, and then season 3 had a lot more of it. I mean, season 2 had already started with Stormfront and Homefront's Stormfront and Homelander's dialogue in the speeches that they were giving, and the way that was manipulating people, being very, very similar to a lot of alt-right talking points. Like, literally, I think they lifted things from Twitter and put it in the dialogue, because I swear I'd seen some of those lines before. And it's stuff that Donald Trump and the people around him were saying, throughout his presidency, and in the lead up to things like the Jan 6 coup, where they stormed the Capitol. Oh, and then you come to the modern series, and you've got things like Homelander's board meeting, like Homelander putting himself in Edgar's position and trying to run a board meeting, and clearly being the stupidest person in the room, the person who knows the least about what he's there for. And, seeing the clusterfuck on Twitter that is Elon Musk running it, that felt so apt. And then of course there's the big plot line for A-Train in season 3, which is Black Lives Matter and racial discrimination. And you have the whole thing with A-Train and Blue Hawk, and you see Blue Hawk victimizing black kids in the neighborhood because he sees them as criminals. And Peacemaker also commented on this as well, this year. And it's like, the Soup Lives Matter thing and the collateral damage, and, Blue Hawk being the sort of character saying, he can do what he wants. Even things like the Scientology megachurch, the Church of the Collective, or the Deep's frickin' Imagine video, which was obviously one of the most parodied things on Twitter during the coronavirus pandemic. Because I get the sentiment that they were going for with that, but my God, it felt tasteless and awful, and so celebrity out of touch with modern society. Oh, we're all in this together, just imagine a better place. Fuck off. You're in a mansion. Oh, the satire is so good. So good. And yeah, it's just hitting all the right buttons for me, this show. It's telling a great story with compelling characters while honing in on the satirical elements to spear not just celebrity culture and corporations and marketing and cinematic universes and superhero culture, but it's doing all of it at once and so deftly, and along with, like, you know, right-wing politics, and I'm loving it. It's so good. And what's even funnier is when you see the people on Twitter who have completely missed the point. The people who think that Homelander is the good guy, the people who are shocked that, you know, he was a Nazi, you know, that he teamed up with a Nazi. Oh, the delicious irony on how much they have missed, how poor their media literacy must be that they have missed that. Because none of this is subtext. Like, nothing in this show is subtext. It is all text. It is right there. You cannot miss it. Homelander is the bad guy. The boys are kind of the good guys, but someone like Butcher is not a good guy. Huey, Starlight, they're good. Frenchie, Kimiko, yeah, they're pretty good too. Butcher, no. Homelander, no. A-Train, no. The Deep, no. And it's all there. And yeah, this is a perfect superhero satire. I gotta admit, after having read the comic and then finding out they were turning it into a show, you know, I think I actually finished reading the comic after the show, after I'd watched season 1. But I'd read some of the comic before, and it just felt like another superhero deconstruction, and I've seen a lot of them. I quite like superheroes being superheroes. Like, I'm a fan of superheroes. I'm not a fan of superhero deconstruction. When it's done well, I love it. The Boys comic, I don't think did it well. The show is doing it so well. Because, like I said, it's not just deconstructing the whole concept of superheroes, it's deconstructing the entire culture around superheroes. And with how much that culture is now a part of modern life, with Marvel being the biggest brand on the face of the planet. Like, you cannot go anywhere without seeing, you know, promotion for a Marvel character. You know, either a toy or a plushie or a kid wearing a t-shirt. You know, characters like... These characters are now front and centre. We are living in the Vought America world, except it's not Vought America, it's Marvel and Disney. And how much this show is honing in on that, and the cinematic universe and the films, love it. Absolutely brilliant. This is the satire we need. So, my friends, thanks for joining me for this episode of The Boys. I've been working on this one for a while, really thinking about what I wanted to say about it, what I wanted to hone in on and focus on throughout this episode. And obviously it took a long time, far longer than I originally meant it to. There's been a lot going on. And I'm hoping that now, finally, I can get this podcast back on track. So yeah, I'm very glad I've finished this episode and that I now have shared it with all of you. Hopefully you've enjoyed it. If there's anything in it that you would like to discuss further with me, you can reach me in all of the usual places. You know, the Linktree, the Discord, Reddit. I'm probably going to be coming off Twitter because of how Elon Musk is running it. How soon that will be, I don't know. But yeah, thank you for joining me. As always, my friends, look after yourself, look after your mental and physical health. It's very important. I'm now a trained mental health first aider. And yeah, it's important to me that everyone looks after their mental health. So, take care, and until the next episode, look after yourselves.
Thank you, my friends, for once again joining me on Gardo Goes Geek. Your continued support for this podcast means the absolute world to me, and I am grateful for every single one of you who stays and listens to one of my episodes. It means the absolute world. Now, if you would like to engage more with me or the podcast, we have a Discord community, small but growing, and we now have commissions open on Ko-Fi. So if there's a topic you would like to see me cover, you can pay me to cover it. All funds will be used for legal purchase of the relevant items where I do not have them. Have a look on the link tree for more information. Until next time, look after yourselves.